A man only had to look at them to know that they were not like other men. Their eyes, their hair, their very being, all proclaimed their differences. And they flew dragons. Gildane writing about the doctrine of exemptionalism, fire and blood, a time of testing, the realm remade. When we think about the history of Aegon's conquest, it's very easy to forget that House Targaryen, maybe thousands of years before Aegon and his sisters landed on the shores of Blackwater Bay, they had a long and proud history that has been overshadowed by the seismic event that was the Conquest of Westeros. House Targaryen and its history is rightly defined by Aegon due to the sheer impact he and his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, had upon the world. But that does not mean we should dismiss all that came before them, even if much of their story has been lost to the fires of old Valyria. The history of pre-Aegon House Targaryen has as much of a role to play due to the simple fact that events transpired the way they did thanks to what came before Aegon, and it allowed his conquest and the reshaping of the world as we know it. To fully understand this story, we must get to know how the dating system in Westeros works. The Maesters of the Citadel in Old Town, who have kept the histories of Westeros since long before Aegon even looked west, have used the conquest as their starting point for dating for the past 300 years. Thus, we will be using the same dating system. AC referring to dates after Aegon's conquest, and BC for events that happened before it. It would be prudent at this stage to rightly point out that like most of Targaryen history, especially pre-conquest, the dating system is far from accurate. Most of the conquest itself took much longer than a single day, with more than 2 years passing between Aegon's initial landing and its completion, with it even then remaining technically incomplete. While the day that Aegon first landed on the shores of Blackwater Bay is celebrated by his descendants, the dating system starts from the day he was crowned and anointed High King of Westeros in the starry sept in Old Town by the High Septon of the Faith of the Seven, which took place 2 years after his landing. Thus the conquest itself, like all of Targaryen history before it, took place between 2 and 1 BC. All Valyrian sorcery was rooted in blood or fire. The sorcerers of the Freehold could see across mountains, seas and deserts. With one of these glass candles, they could enter a man's dreams and give him visions, and speak to one another half a world apart, seated before their candles. Maester Marwyn to Samwell Tarly, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 45, Samwell 5. The Targaryens were of pure Valyrian blood, dragon lords of ancient lineage dating back possibly thousands of years. While they were among the prominent houses of old Valyria, they were on the smaller end of the scale. While rich and prominent by Westerosi standards, in Valyria they would have been counted among the more minor houses. At its apex, Valyria was the greatest city in the known world, the centre of all of civilization. Within its shining walls, 40 rival houses vied for power and glory in court and council, rising and falling in an endless battle for dominance. Valyria was ruled by its dragon lords, as it was in truth the dragons which gave them their power. But they were more than dragon lords. They practiced blood magic and other dark arts, delving deep into the earth for secrets and twisting the flesh of beasts and men to fashion monstrous and unnatural chimeras. It is believed it was for these very sins the gods in their wrath struck Valyria down. The Valyrian Empire, the Freehold, first conquered the old empire of Gis across Slaver's Bay, and then the Giscari colonies in the Basilisk Isles and Sothorios. Seeking slaves for the Valyrian mines, they then conquered and established colonies to the west and north after defeating the Andals and the Rhoynar in Essos. It was the 40 dragon-riding families who controlled the thousands of dragons, and thus they lived in the Freehold itself and in the lands of the long summer. Some dragon lords occasionally visited the colonies of Valyria, most notably Lys, which they founded and used as a pleasure retreat, but they never settled there permanently. The Valyrians are said to have used binding spells and horns to control their dragons, and they used dragon flame to reshape stone into decorative shapes, an art that has now been lost. At its peak, the dragon lords of Old Valyria ruled over most of Essos, while House Targaryen were among the lesser of these dragon lords. They were dragon lords nonetheless. A racial characteristic among the Valyrians appears to have been various shades of purple eyes and hair of silver gold or platinum white. Valyria is said to hold many treasures from before the Doom, such as Valyrian steel blades that become precious across the world, and items of immense magical power. It is said the glass candles of Old Town were brought there from Valyria 1,000 years before the Doom. But this great empire, the like the world had never seen before, would be struck down in a matter of moments to nothing but ash. Almost everything was destroyed. The proudest city in all the world was gone in an instant. Its fabled empire vanished in a day. The lands the long summer scorched and drowned and blighted. The thoughts of Tyrion Lannister. A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 33, Tyrion 8. 12 years before the Doom of Valyria, in 114 BC, Aegon I Targaryen, later known as Aegon the Exile, the head of House Targaryen, shocked his peers when he abruptly sold his holdings in the freehold and the lands of the long summer, offering no explanation. His rivals saw it as a victory, and that House Targaryen could no longer compete in the dangerous game of Valyrian politics. What must have seemed even stranger to the other Valyrian families at the time is that Aegon relocated his wealth, slaves, dragons, kin and children to Dragonstone, a bleak island citadel beneath a smoking mountain in the narrow sea off the eastern coast of Westeros, an old Valyrian stronghold, and the westernmost point of their empire. It is only in hindsight that we know the truth of Aegon's bold action. His maiden daughter, Rhaenys, known to the history books as Rhaenys the Dreamer, had foreseen the destruction of Valyria by fire. Aegon heeded his daughter's warnings, and thus 12 years after her dream, when the ground cracked and Valyria burned, House Targaryen were the only dragon lords to survive. They were not the only Valyrian house to survive the Doom. House Velaryon of Driftmark and House Celtigar of Claw Isle had been minor houses in Valyria who had relocated to the shores of the Narrow Sea long before House Targaryen. But these houses were not dragon lords, rather humble traders with vast fleets. Thus when Aegon first moved to Dragonstone, he found in these lesser houses fast allies whom would help House Targaryen to control Blackwater Bay and the Gullet, making them even richer in the process via the passing trade. The Velaryon ships, along with those of House Celtigar, dominated the Middle Reach and the Narrow Sea, while the Targaryens ruled the skies with their dragons. It was this small power base that over time would allow House Targaryen to gain influence and power. Even so, this new position of power they held as Lords of Dragonstone was nothing compared to all they'd given up when they left Valyria to its doom. But they held one huge asset, and would choose to use them wisely. They controlled the last living dragons. With dragons, almost anything was possible. In the power vacuum Valyria left, House Targaryen were in a prime position to fill it, given they were the only dragon lords left in the world. But they took very little interest in what became known as the Century of Blood that followed the Freehold's downfall. Even so, at this time their focus was still pulled to the east and Essos, rather than the west and the warring kingdoms of Westeros. While we know of the Targaryen lords who followed Aegon after his death, we know very little about their actions and deeds, due to how they isolated themselves to operations around Blackwater Bay and western Essos. Aegon's son would become Lord Dragonstone after his father's death, and for deeds unknown, he earned the title Gaemon the Glorious. Given incestuous marriages were common in Valyria, Gaemon was married to his sister, Rhaenys, the same Rhaenys who dreamed of the coming doom. Their son, Aegon, would inherit after his father's death, and like his parents, was married to a sister, Aelena. After Aegon, the lordship passed to their son, Maegor, who died before marriage or procreation of any heirs. Thus his brother Aerys inherited the lordship. Aerys married a woman whose name has now been lost to history. However, they did have 3 sons, Ixal, Balon, and Damian, who each inherited after the elder brother's subsequent death. Damian's son, Aerion, became lord after his death. He would go on to marry Balena Velaryon, whom herself was half Targaryen via her mother. Aerion would have 3 children. First would come a daughter, they named Visenya, born in 29 BC, a son Aegon, born in 27 BC, and Rhaenys, born in 25 BC. Little did anyone know at the time that these 3 children would go on to become the 3 heads of the dragon who would become the greatest power Westeros had ever seen. But Aerion had one other son, a black-haired bastard, born on some unknown woman The boy was named Orys Baratheon, who, just like his true-born half-siblings, would leave a sizable impact on Westeros. Aegon once stood here as I do, looking down on this table. Do you think we would name him Aegon the Conqueror today if he had not had dragons? Stannis Baratheon to Davos Seaworth, A Storm of Swords, Chapter 54, Davos 5. Given the sheer impact they had on the history of Westeros, we know surprisingly very little about the lives of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters Visenya and Rhaenys prior to the conquest itself. While at this time Westeros was still divided into several kingdoms, the Maesters of the Citadel of Old Town have been documenting the history of Westeros and the rise and fall of kingdoms for centuries, from the pettiest of kings to the rulers of great kingdoms, dating back thousands of years. There is some kind of record for it within the Citadel, and while yes, House Targaryen and Aegon at this time were merely lords of Dragonstone, given their Valyrian heritage, dragons, and control over Blackwater Bay, it does come across as odd that we know so little about the early life of the three heads of the dragon. Visenya, Aegon's eldest sister, was born in 29 BC, Rhaenys, his younger sister, in 25 BC, and Aegon himself in 27 BC. The only true detail we know from their childhood is that from a very young age, both Visenya and Aegon were trained in martial pursuits, with the pair often spending their time training together. Aegon and Visenya both became accomplished swordsmen, with Visenya more than equal to her brother. Upon his father's death, Aegon would wield the Targaryen ancestral Valyrian steel sword Blackfire. Visenya too would be given a Valyrian steel blade of her own, a slimmer blade better suited for a female fighter, a blade called Dark Sister. Both those names would be a legacy written in blood in the years to come. While Rhaenys was not much of a fighter or a swordsman, it is widely accepted given her role in the conquest to come. She too did have some at least minimal training in combat, even if it never did develop into a passion like her siblings. It is a very common myth that Aegon and his sisters never visited Westeros before the conquest, and the day he landed on the shores of Blackwater Bay was the first time he would set foot upon his new kingdom. But this is not the case, and never really made sense in the first place, invented to make the tale of the conquest more exciting. One of the very few things that we know that Aegon and his sisters did pre-conquest as a fact is that he and Visenya at some point in their youth visited Old Town and the Arbour in the Reach. It would be odd that while in Old Town they did not meet with the Lords of Old Town, House Hightower, but if they did this it was not recorded. There is also a rumour suggesting they too visited Lannisport. If this is the case, it's not a huge leap in logic given Lannisport's proximity to Casterly Rock. They may have visited the seat of House Lannister, the then kings in the west. Given how these trips were commonly forgotten when the tales of the conquest are told, it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Aegon and his sisters visited many other places in Westeros over the years, with these trips not set down in the annals of history, like the Old Town trip, which is barely recorded itself. At the very least, it's safe to assume they explored the immediate area around Blackwater Bay, at the very least, especially when it came to building relations with some of the houses that would initially support Aegon during the conquest, such as House Velaryon and House Celtigar. One thing that is often used to try and disprove this idea of Aegon and his sisters visiting Westeros prior to the conquest is that surely if they had flown across the realm on their dragons, that kind of event would have been noteworthy enough historically, given they were the last three dragons in the world, in a place where dragons were far from common to begin with. But in the wider context of events to come, it is easy to see why specific details like this missed being recorded in the history books. It also, of course, is possible that Aegon and his sisters made these trips via land or by ship, but this seems unlikely given how fast dragons are and the security that they provide. House Targaryen, being of Valyrian descent, still practiced many of the lost customs of the freehold, one of these being incestuous marriages between siblings and close relatives, in order to keep the Dragon Riders' bloodlines pure. Thus, it was not a surprise when Aegon married his elder sister, Visenya. What was not expected, however, was Aegon would take a second wife in his younger sister, Rhaenys. By tradition, he would have only been expected to wed his older sister, Visenya. The inclusion of Rhaenys as a second wife was unusual, though not totally without precedent. It is said by some that Aegon wed Visenya out of duty and Rhaenys out of love and desire. It is known that both Aegon and Visenya had claimed their dragons Balerion and Vhagar prior to their marriage. We cannot say when Rhaenys claimed her own dragon, Meraxes. However, given she was the youngest of the siblings, it is possible she claimed her dragon after she married Aegon rather than before. While we do not know the circumstances of Aegon's father, Aegon Targaryen's death, or how long ago it occurred, it is speculated to have been long enough before the conquest to allow for Aegon to spend the next few years preparing himself for it. Aegon would play a small role during the Century of Blood in Essos, where he would gain his first and only known combat experience before the conquest. When Valyria burned, his empire shattered into hundreds of pieces and left a huge power vacuum in Essos. According to history, Orion, a dragon rider who had been visiting Cahor when the Doom came, proclaimed himself the first Emperor of Valyria and raised forces from Corric. With his dragon, an army of 30,000 men, he marched to claim Valyria's remains, but none were ever seen again. It's not clear how Orion met his end. Volantis and the mightiest of the 9 free cities laid claim to Valyria's empire. Meanwhile, the Dothraki rode out of the east, sacking and burning towns and cities in their way, leading to the destruction of several kingdoms that were under Valyrian control. As Valyria's first daughter, the first of the Valyrian colonies, the Voluntees regarded themselves as the rightful successors to the Dragon Lords. The so-called Tigers, aggrieved Volantene nobles, descent of Valyrian blood, called for war upon the other cities, taking control of Lys and Myr and commanding the southern reaches of the Rhoyne. Resistance began when Volantis attempted to take control of Tyrosh, and in the end, all of the free cities, save for Lorath, either rebelled against Volantis or joined the alliance against them. Pentosh gave Tyrosh aid in their resistance, while Myr and Lys rebelled. Cahor and Norvos made an alliance against Volantis and destroyed much of the Volantene fleet controlling the Rhoyne at Dagger Lake. The Titan's wrath was provoked in Braavos, and the Sea Lord of Braavos sent 100 ships to Lys for further aid. The war would even reach Westeros, when Argilac Durrandon, the Storm King, led a host from the Stormlands into the disputed lands of Essos, where he defeated an army from the Voluntees attempting to retake Myr. It was during this time that Pentos and Tyrosh also approached the last remaining Dragon Lords, House Targaryen on Dragonstone, and the young, now Lord, Aegon Targaryen, who agreed to join the alliance against Volantis. He mounted his dragon, Balerion, and flew to Lys, where a Volantene fleet was preparing an invasion. He set the fleet ablaze, and as far as we can tell, this is the only time a member of House Targaryen, between the Doom and the Conquest, actively engaged in war. Some speculated Aegon was using his short involvement in the Century of Blood not only to test himself, but also the viability of a dream, his ambition to forge Westeros into his own mighty kingdom. Prior to Aegon's conquest, and for most of its long and storied history, Westeros was made up of dozens of petty kingdoms, usually consisting of a few towns and castles. Occasionally, and more frequently over time, one of these petty kingdoms would grow and consume those around it until it became a powerful, fully fledged kingdom in its own right. In 2 BC, as Aegon looked across Blackwater Bay from Dragonstone, this is exactly what he saw. Several large kingdoms stuck in a never-ending cycle of war for dominance over the others. As quickly as one kingdom rose, it would fall again just as fast. While the kings of Westeros fought amongst themselves, Aegon Targaryen waited for the right moment to strike and take them all by surprise and capture the kingdoms of Westeros in the name of House Targaryen. Looking back at how history has played out, the statement makes it seem like this was always going to be an easy task, especially with the firepower dragons offered Aegon. But as fragmented as these kingdoms were, they still had the manpower, resources and motivation to put up a fierce fight. The Lannisters make enemies easily, but have a harder time keeping friends. Halden to John Connington, A Dance with Dragons Chapter 61, The Griffin Reborn. The kings of House Lannister had ruled the Westerlands for thousands of years after taking Casterly Rock, from the last Casterly. Due to the sheer amount of gold they've been able to mine from Casterly Rock, the Lannisters were by far the richest house in all of the realm, and thus were able to muster a huge army to defend their kingdom. Not only that, but they were one of the few kingdoms outside of the Iron Islands who were able to field a large and effective navy that was mostly used to protect trade in and out of Lannisport from Ironborn raids. They also used this wealth as a means to expand their new kingdom, and over thousands of years had warred with near on every single one of their neighbouring kingdoms, including the Gardener Kings of the Reach, the Storm Kings in the east, and a number of petty river kings. The king at the time of the conquest was King Loren Lannister. While we know little about his reign prior to the conquest, we do know that he managed to maintain a short period of peace with the Kings of the Reach, House Gardener, after what has been speculated as decades of bloody border conflicts. It's hard to say if he was allies with Mern Gardener at this point, or if indeed the arrival of Aegon, which saw these historic enemies join their forces. Even before the alliance with the Gardeners, in a straight-up battle with the Lannister army, Aegon, without the use of his dragons, would have struggled to win the day, not even being close to matching the number of men the kings of the West could call upon. The winters are hard, but the Starks will endure. We always have. Eddard Stark to Robert Baratheon, A Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard I. The north of Westeros was ruled by the Kings of Winter, House Stark, for thousands of years, as far back as the first main kingdoms forged in the wake of the Long Night. The kings in the north very rarely became embroiled with the wars of the southern kingdoms, especially after the coming of the Andals. That does not mean, however, that House Stark's hold on the north was never challenged in those thousands of years. Before they controlled the entirety of the north, the Starks were constantly warring with the kings of House Bolton, whom controlled large sections of the north. The wars between the houses would be bloody and brutal. During the coming of the Andals, the Starks and the Boltons did form an uneasy alliance as they attempted to push back the invaders. House Stark also managed to subjugate the rival Barrow Kings and Marsh Kings, giving them total dominion of the north after they defeated the Boltons. They would still often war with raiders from the Iron Islands on their western coast, as well as working with the Night's Watch to deal with wildling incursions from beyond the wall. At the time of Aegon's conquest, King Torrhen Stark ruled the north from Winterfell and was able to field around 30,000 men. While not the largest army the kings of Westeros could field, the Northmen had a reputation as fierce fighters who would fight bravely and without fear. You need to come south. You need to taste the summer before it flees. In Highgarden there are fields of golden roses that stretch away as far as the eye can see. The fruits are so ripe they explode in your mouth. Melons, peaches, fire plums. You've never tasted such sweetness. King Robert Baratheon to Eddard Stark. A Game of Thrones Chapter 4, Eddard I. The Gardener Kings of the Reach are perhaps the oldest kingdom in Westeros, with House Gardener descending from the first king of the First Men, the legendary Garth Greenhand. The Reach is known as the breadbasket of Westeros, growing food that feeds near every kingdom, and in turn, the Kings of the Reach at times have neared the wealth of House Lannister. The Kingdom of the Reach would often fight wars with the Lannister Kings and the Storm Kings of House Durrandon. However, they also had to contend with the incursions from the Dornish to the south in the Dornish marches around the Red Mountains, with frequent attacks on towns and villages, with some bold enough to attack Old Town itself. While border wars were common, it does seem that Mern the Ninth Gardener had established a peaceful coexistence with King Loren Lannister. The Reach contains Old Town, the seat of House Hightower, which at this time was the largest city and most important port in Westeros, which allowed the economy of the Reach to thrive to an extent the Gardener Kings were able to mint their own coinage prior to Aegon's conquest. It's not wholly clear, but it is safe to assume that the other larger kingdoms had their own currencies prior to the conquest, until they were unified into one single realm under the control of House Targaryen. Being the breadbasket of Westeros, they were able to keep their troops fed. With his alliance with Loren Lannister, the two could field an army with a minimum of 50,000 men. In most normal wars, that number of men would be near unbeatable, but this wasn't going to be a normal war, and King Mern had vastly underestimated the threat of House Targaryen to his peril. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril. Mira Martell to Rhaenys Targaryen. The World of Ice and Fire. The Reign of the Dragons. The Conquest. Out of all of the kingdoms of Westeros, prior to the Conquest, Dorne was by far the most politically stable and united. Like every other kingdom in Westeros, Dorne was initially made up of several petty kingdoms, during both the Age of Heroes and the coming of the Andals, but in around 700 BC. Mors Martell, head of House Martell, at the time one of the smaller houses in Dorne, married the Dornish warrior queen Nymeria, who had led her people to Dorne on a long, perilous journey, seeking refuge after the Dornish Wars all but destroyed her people. With the settling of the Rhoynar in Dorne, House Martell was able to bring the whole kingdom under its control very quickly, with it remaining so ever since. The Dornish often war with the kingdoms of the Reach and Stormlands on their northern borders past the Red Mountains. However, rather than full-scale wars, they are much more likely to send smaller raiding parties into the Dornish marches. It was difficult for the Reachmen and the Stormlanders to strike back in the harsh terrain of Dorne, with it being either mountainous or a never-ending desert. Without the knowledge of the Dornish, it's near impossible to cross, with many armies becoming lost in its sands. The Dornish often proved hard to fight, avoiding pitched battles, favouring hit-and-run and guerrilla warfare tactics that used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The Dornish are also incredibly proud people, and with Dorne being the only kingdom the Rhoynar settled, are often united in their ideals. Thus, conquering Dorne was always going to prove a challenge, holding it more so, a lesson Aegon would learn to his detriment during the conquest. For the most part, the Kingdom of the Vale, under House Arryn, was one of the more stable kingdoms of Westeros, with much of this down to the natural geography, making the Vale easy to defend and harder to attack, thanks to the mountainous terrain and high cliffs along the coastline. But one huge issue for the kings of the Vale, House Arryn, was their king. Ronald Arryn was a small child who came to his throne at his father's sudden death. Thus the Vale was being ruled by his mother, Shara Arryn, as Queen Regent, until he came of age. While by all accounts Shara was a competent ruler and did a fine job managing the kingdom for her son, the fact the king was a child and the Vale ruled by a woman in the eyes of more arrogant and misguided foes might make the Vale seem weak and a prime target. Even so, the Lords of the Vale were behind Shara, and it would be no easy task for a traditional invading army to take the Vale. But that's the thing, Aegon and his sisters didn't just have an army, they had dragons, which would make all the Vale's impregnable natural defences all but useless. At the time of the conquest, Stormlands had been ruled for thousands of years by House Durrandon, and like with most kingdoms over that time, it rose and fell, then rose again, through an endless cycle of war and peace, with the neighbouring kingdoms, specifically the Reach and Westerlands, and to some extent Dorne. When he was a boy, King Argilac managed to turn back a Dornish invasion, and countless raids into the Marches. Then, towards the end of the Century of Blood, he joined the Great Alliance against the Tigers from Volantis, and led a host into the disputed lands, being one of the few Westerosi kings we know to have done so. He marched against an army from Volantis, which was attempting to retake Myr. 20 years later, he killed King Gar VII Gardener in a battle of Summerfield. He began to look north to expand his borders into the area that would become known as the Crownlands, but in doing so he would be at odds with the mightiest of the kings of Westeros. Harrenhal, better known in the history books as Harren the Black, the king of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, who too was looking to expand his kingdom into the Crownlands. Thus a border dispute and war between the two kingdoms was bound to happen sooner or later. The power of Harren cannot be understated. He controlled not just the Iron Islands, but the Riverlands, with the Riverlands being vital in moving trade across the Seven Kingdoms, with the Trident being its lifeblood. Over the last 2 generations, his forefathers had worked to create this kingdom that would be known as the Kingdom of the Isles and Rivers, with Harren ruling it at its apex. He ruled with fear, and while he was not loved by his people, he ruled effectively. For most of his life, he had been building a new monstrous castle on the banks of the God's Eye, using the resources of the Iron Islands and Riverlands to build it. None of the other kings of Westeros had the power individually to face Harren, given the scale of his kingdom and the amount of men he could call upon. But Harren's brutal way of ruling had started to cause resentment back on the Iron Islands. While Harren claimed to be Ironborn first and foremost, he only visited the Isles a handful of times, and mostly to exploit its resources and manpower to further expand his growing kingdom. With Harrenhal at the centre of his realm, and some have begun to question exactly how Ironborn Harren truly was. With Harrenhal at the centre of his realm, there's no telling what Harren could achieve, and how much land he could take from the other kingdoms. Westeros had been in a cycle of war and peace, growth and decline, and infighting amongst its kings for generations. It was unstable, with borders shifting constantly. None of this was conducive to growth, and ultimately it was the small folk who would suffer. All it would take is one single spark to light the fuse that would send these kings of Westeros into chaos. Aegon would light that flame. Aegon's carpenters had shaped it after the land of Westeros, sawing out each bay and peninsula until the table nowhere ran straight. On its surface, darkened by near 300 years of varnish, were painted the Seven Kingdoms, as they had been in Aegon's day. Rivers, mountains, castles and cities, lakes and forests, the thoughts of Maester Crescent, A Clash of Kings, Prologue. Aegon Targaryen invaded Westeros in 2 BC, an event that would fundamentally change Westeros forever, and while we cannot know why he chose this exact moment to strike out from Dragonstone, the common train of thought was he believed the political situation unstable enough that many of the kings would not be able to organise a unified defence. While we can never know his true motivations and why he chose this very moment, he did. And one thing we can say for sure is Westeros, as it had been for generations, was divided into several quarrelsome kingdoms, and there was hardly a time when 2 or 3 of these kingdoms was not at war with another. In the vast, cold, stony north, by far the largest of the kingdoms in landmass, was ruled by House Stark of Winterfell, the Kings of Winter. In the harsh deserts of Dorne, the Martell princes held sway for generations after a marriage pact with Nymeria and her Rhaenys refugees settled the coastline. The gold-rich Westerlands were ruled by the Lannisters of Casterly Rock, the fertile Reach by the Gardeners of Highgarden, who acted as the breadbasket to much of Westeros. The Vale of Arryn, the Fingers and the Mountain of the Moon belonged to House Arryn, but was under the regency of Queen Regent Shara Arryn, as her son King Ronald was but a small child. All of these kingdoms would give Aegon their own challenges, but at the start of the conquest, it seemed that the Storm King and the King of the Isles and Rivers would give Aegon the biggest challenge. This is what made the initial conquest a more challenging prospect, given that these 2 belligerent kings were the 2 whose realms lay closest to Dragonstone, Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant. From the ancient great castle perched upon cliff edges, this Storm's End is an old place. There are spells woven into the stones, dark walls that no shadow can pass, ancient, forgotten, yet still in place. Melisandre to Davos Seaworth, A Clash of Kings Chapter 42, Davos 2. Storm's End, the seat of the Storm Kings of House Durrandon, had once ruled the eastern half of Westeros, from Cape Wrath to the Bay of Crabs, but their power had been dwindling for centuries. They would follow a pattern of growth, then rapid decline, before expanding their borders once more. The Gardener Kings of the Reach had slowly chipped away at their dominion from the west. The Dornishmen harassed them from the south in the form of raids into the Dornish marches, and King Harren the Black and his Iron Men had pushed them from the Trident and the lands north of the Blackwater Rush, with Harren controlling not just the Iron Islands, but the Riverlands as well, with an eye of further expansion to the contested coastline around Blackwater Bay. King Argilac Durrandon had slowed the decline for a time, turning back a Dornish invasion while still a boy, then also crossing the Narrow Sea to join a great alliance against the Imperialist Tigers of Atlantis, and slaying Garsk the Seventh Gardener, King of the Reach, in the Battle of Summerfield 20 years later. He even now looked to expand his borders further north, into the area that would become the Crownlands. But time waits for no man, and Argilac had grown older, and was not the warrior he had once been. His famous mane of black hair had gone grey, and his prowess at arms had faded. While he was by far feeble, it was clear he was not the man of his youth, who had done all of these great deeds. Harren had beggared the Riverlands and Iron Islands alike to ornate his dream. The Thoughts of Catelyn Stark, A Clash of Kings Chapter 7, Catelyn 1. North of the Blackwater River, the Riverlands were ruled by the bloody hand of Harren the Black, of House Hoare, the king of the Isles and Rivers. House Hoare had spent the last few generations conquering and stabilising the Riverlands under their rule, reaching its apex with Harren. Harren's grandsire, Harwin Hardhand, had taken the trident from Argalac's grandfather, Arek, whose own forebearers had thrown down the last of the River Kings centuries earlier. Harren's own father had extended his domains east to Duskendale and Rosby. Harren himself had devoted much of his long reign, close to near 40 years, to building the gigantic castle beside the God's Eye, known as Harrenhal, pouring much of the wealth and resources and manpower, not just of the Riverlands, but of the Iron Islands as well, into its construction. Harrenhal was built on a scale never seen since in Westeros, and no castle like it had been built since the Age of Heroes, in the days after the Long Night. But with Harrenhal finally nearing completion, the Ironborn would soon be free to seek fresh conquests, using Harren's great castle as a launching point into the southern kingdoms of Westeros. The reason Harren was so keen in taking the area that would become the Crown Lands was very simple. By doing so, House Hoare would now control a large amount of coast on the eastern coast of Westeros, meaning they could control the landmass from coast to coast, which would allow them to more easily field its navy in the narrow sea, without having to sail around the whole of Westeros and up the Stepstones. The situation on the borders of the Riverlands and the Stormlands was tense, and it would not have taken much for it to spill over into a full-on war. A war King Argilac knew he would struggle to win. No king in Westeros was more feared than Black Harren, whose cruelty had become legendary all throughout the Seven Kingdoms, with the effective use of slaves in all but name to build Harrenhal. But no king in Westeros felt more threatened than Argilac Durrandon, the Storm King, with the aging warrior's only heir his maiden daughter, with the succession beyond her either non-existent or very unclear. Should Argilac die, it is thought by many historians that the kingdom of the Stormlands would have shattered into petty kingdoms, being eaten up by the bigger neighbouring kingdoms. But why was this so? It's because there had never been a ruling queen in the Stormlands, and it's believed very few would have followed Argella Durrandon, her father's heir or not. We believe it's because of this the Storm King took a more diplomatic solution, something very much against his nature. He reached out to the Dragon Lords of House Targaryen on Dragonstone, offering Lord Aegon Targaryen his daughter in marriage, with all the lands east of the God's Eye, from the Trident to the Blackwater Rush, as her dowry, the very lands currently being contested by Argilac and Harren. Aegon, of course, refused the Storm King's proposal. Rightly, he pointed out in his reply that he already had 2 wives, and did not need a third, and the lands being offered had belonged to House Hoare for more than a generation. While contested by House Durrandon, they were not Argilac's to give away, when he technically, at this time, did not hold them. Plainly, the old Storm King meant to establish House Targaryen along the coast of Blackwater Bay in their own petty kingdom as a buffer zone between his own lands and those of Harren the Black, believing Harren would be a fool to try and invade this hypothetical petty kingdom with dragon lords in control. In principle, is not an awful plan, and a lesser lord may have accepted these terms. But Argilac wasn't treating with a lesser lord. He did not view House Targaryen as his equals. They were not kings, and while this is true, he forgot one key factor. They were the last dragon lords of Valyria. The very thing that would have offered Argilac protection was vastly underestimated by him. It does seem that Aegon was at the very least willing to entertain the discussions, and we are not entirely sure how long before the conquest itself these talks took place. Some suggested it could have been months, others several years. Much of history during this era is vague and lost to time, mostly being speculation, based on the events we know occurred. The Lord of Dragonstone countered with his own offer. He would take the dower lands being offered if Argilac would also cede Massey's Hook and the woods and plains from the Blackwater south to the River Wendwater and the headwaters of the Mander. The pact would be sealed by the marriage of Argilac's daughter, Argella, to Orys Baratheon, Lord Aegon's childhood friend and champion, and unknown to the wider nobility of Westeros at the time, Aegon's bastard half-brother. But Argilac did know of Orys Baratheon's bastardy. Thus, Argilac the Arrogant rejected these terms in a rage. He insisted he would not dishonour his daughter by giving her hand in marriage to a bastard. The very suggestion enraged him. He had the hands of Aegon's envoy cut off and returned to him in a box. These are the only hands you shall have of me, he is said to have wrote, in a reply to Aegon. Some say that Aegon expected Argilac's angry response, and thus never had any intention of sending a reply. Aegon once stood here as I do now, looking down on this table. Do you think we would name him Aegon the Conqueror today if he had not had dragons? Stannis Baratheon to Davos Seaworth, A Storm of Swords chapter 54, Davos 5. Instead, he called his banners, summoning his friends, lords, and allies to attend him on Dragonstone. The numbers were small, mostly made up of seats around Blackwater Bay itself. The most prominent of these lords were the Velaryons of Driftmark, who had been close allies of House Targaryen since they arrived to Dragonstone from Valyria before the Doom, and had been sworn to them ever since. As were the Celtigars of Claw Isle. Both House Velaryon and Celtigar were Valyrian houses. However, they were very minor and were not dragon lords like the Targaryens. From Massey's Hook came Lord Bar Emmon of Sharp Point and Lord Massey of Stonedance, both of whom had been sworn to Storm's End and the Storm Kings, but with close ties to Dragonstone since the arrival of House Targaryen. Aegon and his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, took counsel with them in the chamber of the Painted Table as they laid out their plan for the coming conquest. It is said that after this meeting, they visited the Castle Sept to pray to the Seven, though Aegon himself had never actually been known as a pious or religious man. In fact, it is believed that Aegon actively converted House Targaryen to the faith of the Seven, with the simple goal of making their future conquest of Westeros more palatable to the lords and small folk who might mistrust their old Valyrian gods and customs. This may have been a smart move, given how the idea of blood magic and sacrifice has become associated with the power of old Valyria. On the seventh day, a cloud of ravens burst from the towers of Dragonstone to bring Aegon's word to the seven kingdoms of Westeros. To the seven kings they flew, to the citadel of Oldtown, to lords both great and small. Each bird carried the same message. From this day forth, there would be but one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee to Aegon of House Targaryen would keep their lands and titles. Those who took up arms against him would be thrown down and humbled and destroyed. We also have a sudden plague of holy men. The comet has brought forth all manner of queer priests, preachers and prophets, it would seem. They beg in the wine sinks and pot shops, and foretell doom and destruction to anyone who will listen. We are close on 300 years since Aegon's landing. I suppose it's only to be expected. Let them rant. Varys and Tyrion Lannister, A Clash of Kings chapter 8, Tyrion 2. In many ways, Aegon's landing is a before and after event of the history of Westeros, in the same way as the Long Night or the Andal invasion. After these events, Westeros fundamentally changed forever. But what's so different about Aegon's conquest versus the other key events is they are not defined by a single event. For example, it is said the Long Night lasted a generation. Then, when the Andals landed in the Vale, it took decades to gain control, and multiple generations to spread across the whole of Westeros, south of the Neck. These monumental shifts in power and society don't happen as quick as looking back retroactively implies they did. But this is what makes Aegon's conquest stand out among all of these events. It has one key aspect that makes it very different: the sheer speed and efficiency at which Aegon took the Seven Kingdoms, doing so in the best part of 2 years. But it goes much deeper than that. Not only had House Targaryen taken Westeros, their rule in the early years was all but unchallenged, with the 7 individual kingdoms of Westeros integrating into one united kingdom under Aegon much more smoothly than anyone could have foreseen. And it all started the day the Velaryon and Celtigar ships landed on the shores of Blackwater Bay, as Aegon and his sisters looked on from atop their dragons. Unfortunately, accounts tend to differ how many men sailed from Dragonstone with Aegon and his sisters. All we know for sure is that they were a relatively small number when compared to the hosts of the kings of Westeros could call to their banner. Some say as many as 3,000. Others the number was only a few hundred. Given Dragonstone itself had a very low population of small folk, and Aegon's bannermen could only muster a small number of swords themselves, the smaller size of Aegon's army it's not wholly surprising. Under normal circumstances, you would have called Aegon a mad fool for provoking the ire of the Storm King Argilac Durandon, or the infamous Harren the Black, but the conquest was far from a normal circumstance, and would be a new type of warfare most in Westeros had never seen before, and were all too ill prepared to face. Blackwater Bay was rough and choppy, white caps everywhere. The Thoughts of Davos Seaworth, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 58, Davos 3. The modest Targaryen host put ashore at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, on the northern bank, where 3 wooded hills rose above a small fishing village. In many ways, this landscape offered the perfect anchorhead in an invasion. Huge forests to the south, 3 huge defendable hills, and an abundance of natural resources. Aegon could defend this anchorhead with little worry. This area would in time be known as the Crown Lands, and would become the personal holdings of House Targaryen. But back in the days of the 100 Kingdoms, many petty kings had claimed dominion over the Blackwater Rush, as well as the coastline around Blackwater Bay itself. The most obvious of these is the Darkland Kings of Duskendale, given their proximity and the fact that Duskendale is one of the largest towns in Westeros, with many surprised it never became a city in its own right. You also had the Masses of Stonedance and the many River Kings who had claimed the Riverlands before Harren the Black, the likes of the Mudds, the Fishers, the Brackens, the Blackwoods, or the Hooks. The 3 hills near where Aegon had chosen to land had once had towers and forts that crowned them at various times, only to be thrown down in one war or another and left to ruin, with now only broken stones and overgrown foundations remaining to welcome the Targaryens. But the existence of these ruins goes a long way in showcasing the defensive capabilities of the area. Though the Crownlands, specifically the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, was claimed by both Storm's End and Harrenhal, the river mouth was undefended, and the closest castles were held by much lesser lords of no great power or military prowess, and lords moreover who had little reason to love their nominal overlord, Harren the Black, or Argilac Durandon. In fact, it was hoped some of these houses might rally to Aegon's banner freely. Aegon quickly threw up a log and earth palisade around the highest of the 3 hills that would soon become known as the Aegonfort. From here, the conquest would begin in earnest. He dispatched his sisters Visenya and Rhaenys on their dragons to secure the submission of the nearest castles. It is said that Rosby yielded to Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes without a fight. At Stokeworth, a few crossbowmen loosed bolts at Visenya until Vhagar's flames set the roofs of the castle ablaze. They then too submitted, knowing they stood no chance of victory against the dragon. The capture of Rosby and Stokeworth was as straightforward and as routine as anyone could have hoped for. Aegon's dragons were named for the gods of Old Valyria. Visenya's dragon was Vhagar, Rhaenys had Meraxes, and Aegon rode Balerion, the Black Dread. It was said that Vhagar's breath was so hot that it could melt a knight in his armour and cook the man inside, that Meraxes swallowed horses whole, and Balerion, his fires were as black as his scales, his wings so vast that whole towns were swallowed up in their shadow when he passed overhead. Daenerys Targaryen to her Blood Riders, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 12, Daenerys 1. But the first true test came from Lord Starkland of Duskendale and Lord Mooten of Maidenpool. Both Duskendale and Maidenpool were large towns that could call upon a sizable number of swords in a short space of time. In a normal pitched battle, there would have been questions as to if Aegon had the number to prevail. Lord Starkland and Mooten merged their armies and marched south with the intent of pushing the invaders back into the bay, but they were met with nothing but black fire on the march. Orys Baratheon, Aegon's bastard half-brother, had attacked the joint forces of Starkland and Mooten head-on, with Aegon himself descending from above on the monstrous Balerion the Black Dread, the largest of the Targaryen dragons, and the only living dragon at the time to have seen Valyria before its doom. Both lords were slain in a one-sided battle that followed. Darkland's son and Mooten's brother thereafter yielded up their castles and swore their swords to House Targaryen. Duskendale at the time was the most important Westerosi port on the Narrow Sea, and had grown fat and wealthy from the trade that passed through its harbour. Thus, Visenya Targaryen did not allow the towns to be sacked, but she did not hesitate to claim its riches for Aegon, greatly swelling the coffers of the conquerors. When looking back at the way history remembers Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys Targaryen, the three heads of the dragon who conquered Westeros, it's easy to forget that these three monolithic figures were real people, with personalities and complex relationships. The idea gets even more complicated when you consider that despite the key role both Visenya and Rhaenys would play, not just in the conquest, but its aftermath is remembered solely as Aegon's conquest, with his two sisters and wives playing second fiddle to Aegon himself. But at the same time, we know far more about Visenya and Rhaenys as people than Aegon himself, with him almost becoming an enigma of a person, which in turn has added to the legend that is Aegon the Conqueror, with the relatively blank canvas he presents, making it easy for historians and small folk with generations to paint him as the figure of Targaryen dominance they needed him to be. But with the information we have about Aegon and his sisters, we can piece together a rough picture of what they were like as people and the complex relationship dynamic between them. You're a fool and a weakling, nephew. Do you think any man would have ever dared speak so to your father? You have a dragon. Use him. Fly to Old Town and make this starry sept another Harrenhal, or give me leave and let me roast this pious fool for you, Visenya Targaryen. To King Aenys I, Fire and Blood, the sons of the dragon. Visenya Targaryen was the eldest of the three siblings, born in 29 BC, which would have made her 27 years of age at the start of Aegon's conquest. She possessed, like both of her siblings, the classical Valyrian features of silver gold hair, which she often braided or bound up in rings, and of course, purple or violet eyes. While no doubt beautiful, like all of the blood of old Valyria, Visenya's was a harsher and more austere beauty than her sister Rhaenys. While described as a passionate and driven woman, Visenya was also stern, serious, and unforgiving to those who dared to cross her. She was followed by rumours that she dabbled in the dark arts of sorcery and played with poisons and potions. But we cannot know how much of this is fact and how much of this is pure speculation, based on her rough and unforgiving character, with her foes wishing to discredit her. From a young age, Visenya trained with Aegon in the yard at Dragonstone, with her becoming a skilled warrior, some say more skilled with a blade than Aegon the Conqueror himself. She wielded the Valyrian steel blade Dark Sister, a slim, slender blade, suited better for the hands of a female fighter than Aegon's bastard sword, Blackfire. Visenya was wed to her brother Aegon, following the Valyrian custom of sibling marriages. However, Aegon also took their younger sister, Rhaenys, as a wife as well. While polygamy did happen in Old Valyria, it was far less common. What is not wholly clear if the marriage between Aegon and Rhaenys occurred at the same time as Visenya's marriage to Aegon, or sometime later. Regardless, people claim that Aegon had wed Visenya out of duty, and Rhaenys out of desire. Given what we know of the relationship between Aegon and Visenya, this statement appears to be at least in some degree true. While Visenya clearly loved her brother, it was a very different love than that of Rhaenys. Some time prior to her wedding, Visenya became a dragon rider, having bonded with the dragon Vhagar, the second largest and second oldest of the three Targaryen dragons at the time of Aegon's conquest. I will not fight you, nor will I kneel to you. Dorne has no king. Tell your brother that. I shall. But we will come again, princess, and the next time we shall come with fire and blood. Miro Martell and Rhaenys Targaryen, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. Rhaenys was the youngest of the three Targaryen siblings who conquered Westeros. In many ways, she was everything her sister Visenya was not. Playful, curious, impulsive, given to countless flights of fancy. We don't know for certain the age of Rhaenys, but it is implied that she was 2 years younger than her brother Aegon, making her 23 or 24 years old at the start of the conquest. While Visenya spent hours in the training yard honing her skills at arms, Rhaenys was no true warrior and possessed only basic understanding of combat and swordplay. She loved music, dancing and poetry, and was the patron and supported many a singer, mummer, puppeteer and artist, which is something that would become much more prominent when House Targaryen set up their court in King's Landing, with Rhaenys herself having a huge impact on the atmosphere and tone of the court in the Aegonfort. Out of all three siblings, she by far spent the most time on Dragonback, more than her brother and sister put together. She always talked about one day flying her dragon Meraxes out across the Sunset Sea to see what lands lay beyond. Rhaenys was said to be a beautiful woman, with silver gold hair, which she kept long and wore loose, with purple eyes and a slender waist, and the pure definition of Valyrian beauty. It's clear that Rhaenys and Aegon had a very different relationship than Aegon and Visenya, given that Aegon had chosen to marry Rhaenys out of love rather than the duty in which he married Visenya. There are some that claim that for every 10 nights he spent with Rhaenys, he would spend one with Visenya. Like every king and queen that sat the Iron Throne, detractors tend to try and spin rumours and tales to discredit them. Given this unique marital arrangement between the 3 Targaryen siblings, it's not surprising some of these detractors speculated to be members of the faith who took issue with the incestuous nature of House Targaryen, would seek to tarnish their legacy. Rumours exist when it comes to Aegon and his sisters, like any and every king of Westeros. One of these rumours suggests that while no one questioned Visenya Targaryen's fidelity to her brother and husband, Rhaenys is said to have surrounded herself with comely young men, and it was whispered, even entertained some in her bedchambers on the nights when Aegon was with her elder sister. But the issue is, like most rumours of the sort, there is little to no evidence that indicates there's any truth to these tales, with most taking it as baseless speculation and conjecture. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterwards he gave them peace, prosperity, and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. While we know a reasonable amount about Aegon's sisters, we in fact know very little of substance about the man himself. Aegon was born in 27 BC, making him only 25 years of age when he landed on the shores of the Blackwater Rush, on the site of what would become King's Landing. Much of what we do know about him is through his actions and his relationships with the people around him. Armed with the Valyrian steel blade Blackfire, he was counted amongst the greatest warriors of his age. Yet he took no pleasure in feats of arms, and never rode in tourneys or fought in melees. It is believed he was trained alongside his sister Visenya, whom it was said was a much more competent warrior on a technical level. While we don't know when he claimed his dragon, it is speculated it was sometime before his marriage to his sisters. His mount was Balerion the Blackdread, the largest and the oldest of the Targaryen dragons, and the last remaining of the 5 Aenar the Exile had brought with him from Valyria to Dragonstone before the Doom. Aegon did not possess the natural love of flying his sister Rhaenys did. He flew only to battle, or to travel quickly across land and sea. His commanding presence drew men to his banner, yet he had no close friends or confidants, save for one, Orys Baratheon, the companion of his youth and his bastard half-brother. It is said he trusted no man more than Orys Baratheon. Women were drawn to him, but Aegon remained ever faithful to his sisters, or so the tales claim. As king, he put great trust in his small council and his sisters, leaving much of the day-to-day governance of the realm to them. Yet he did not hesitate to take command when he found it necessary. Though he dealt harshly with rebels and traitors, he was open-handed with his former foes who bent the knee, something which during the conquest would bring allies to his banner. When Queen Visenya placed the Valyrian steel circlet, studded with rubies, on her brother's head, and Queen Rhaenys held him, Aegon, first of his name, king of all of Westeros, and shield of his people, the dragons roared as one, and the lords and knights sent up a cheer. The writings of Galdane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. While the Conquest has gone down in history as Aegon's, Visenya and Rhaenys Targaryen were effectively equal partners in it. His sisters and wives, as well as perhaps Orys Baratheon, had a level of trust and respect from Aegon few would come close to achieving. Few other queens in the history of Targaryen Westeros would have the freedom and power Visenya and Rhaenys possessed. The only other queen most historians would agree on is Queen Alysanne Targaryen, the wife and sister of Jaehaerys the Conciliator, one of the few kings whose reputation and legend rivals that of Aegon the Conqueror himself. This way of ruling and the power Aegon's queens had is not something many of the kingdoms in Westeros were used to seeing. Thus, very early in the conquest, Aegon would send a clear message to those who would call him king, the position and power of his sisters. He would do this for the first time at the newly constructed Aegonfort, an earth and wood keep constructed on the highest of the 3 hills that sat beside the Blackwater Rush. These 3 hills from that day on would be known as Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys' Hill. However, the specific exact origin who suggested the names is lost to time. Aegon had effectively secured the area around the Blackwater Rush on both sides of the river and taken several small castles and towns in the area that would become known as the Crown Lands. But even though the conquest was just starting, a moment was taken to consolidate House Targaryen's small new kingdom. Aegon had made the 7 kingdoms one with fire and blood. The writings of Galdane. Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. All of Aegon's new lords were commanded to attend him at the Aegonfort. There was some fear Aegon meant to kill them and replace them with his own men, but instead he raised them up and confirmed each and every lord in their lands and titles. But his oldest and most loyal supporters were rewarded. Daemon Balerion, Lord of the Tides, was made Master of Ships and given command of the royal fleet, which ironically at this time was mostly made up of Velaryon vessels, with many Lords of the Tides holding this position for centuries to come, with the title of Master of Ships being seen as hereditary in an unofficial capacity, as other men from other houses a few times would take on the role. Tristan Massey, the Lord of Stonedance, was named the Master of Law, Crispin Celtigar, Master of Coin, and Orys Baratheon, his half-brother and childhood friend, he proclaimed to be my shield, my stalwart, my strong right hand. Thus, Orys Baratheon is reckoned to be, by maesters, the first hand of the king, even if the title and role wasn't yet defined. As while the small council itself was not officially an organisation at this time, by the reigns of Aegon's successors, it would become an invaluable tool for the kings of Westeros in assisting the running of the huge united kingdom that would be Westeros. You Westerosi are all the same. You sew some beast on a scrap of silk, and suddenly you are all lions and dragons, or eagles. Ilario Mopatis, the Tyrion Lannister. A Dance with Dragons, Chapter 1, Tyrion 1. The history of heraldry in Westeros is long and complex, and in truth we have no true idea when it was started or by whom. But for many Westerosi houses, their heraldry and house words display to others who they are, and some facet of their long and storied history. You can travel from the far north to the sands of Dorne, and a stranger could learn much about you and what you stand for from the heraldry you wore. For whatever reason, heraldry, at least the Westerosi way of doing it, does not exist across the narrow sea in Essos, for the most part, which to many indicates it's perhaps an Andal, or more likely a First Men concept. Even in Valyria, at its height, the great houses of the Dragon Lords use no banners or house words, at least not in the more upfront Westerosi way we're familiar with. Thus, House Targaryen had never had a banner or house words of their own, even after its relocation from Valyria to Dragonstone before the Doom. It seems the other Valyrian houses who made the Blackwater Bay their home, the Velaryons and the Celtigars, had heraldry long before Aegon's conquest, likely because they had been part of the Westerosi culture long before House Targaryen came to Dragonstone, and thus had built a Westerosi identity for themselves, separate from their Valyrian heritage. But all this would change with Aegon's conquest, as House Targaryen would have a new identity that would become core to their place in Westeros. As his lords watched on, Aegon's knights unfurled a new great silk battle standard, the new heraldry of House Targaryen for a new Westeros, a red 3-headed dragon upon a black field. It's believed that each of the heads of the dragon represented the 3 conquerors themselves, Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys. It is widely accepted that Aegon created this new heraldry for House Targaryen for the exact same reason he converted to the faith of the Seven, to help integrate House Targaryen closer into Westerosi culture, showing the lords he was one of them and the right man to follow, perhaps to even make him more palatable for those who had reservations about him. It seems, whatever Aegon's intent, it worked, and the lords assembled at the Aegonfort saw him as one of their own, and a worthy High King of all of Westeros. And then, Queen Visenya placed a Valyrian steel circlet, studded with rubies, on her brother's head, and Queen Rhaenys held him as Aegon, first of his name, king of all of Westeros and shield of his people. It is said, as she finished, the dragons roared loud as the lords and knights set up cheers. But it was the small folk, the fishermen, the field hands, and the good wives who shouted out the loudest. Not all were pleased at this proclamation of this new High King, and they would not bend the knee to this foreign dragon lord. Most of all, the 7 kings that Aegon meant to uncrown. In Harrenhal, the monstrous castle on the banks of the God's Eye, and Storm's End, perched on a perilous cliff in the Stormlands, Harren the Black and Argilac the Arrogant had called their banners when news of Aegon taking the area around the Blackwater Rush had reached them. In the west, King Mern the Ninth Gardener of the Reach left his seat of Highgarden and rode the ocean road north to Casterly Rock to meet with his long-term rival and enemy, King Lauren of House Lannister, King of the Rock. The threat Aegon posed to their power was so great, these 2 historical enemies looked to join their forces to meet his challenge. Some saw an opportunity in the conquest. The Princess of Dorne, Mira Martell, dispatched a raven to the Aegonfort, offering to join Aegon against Argilac the Storm King, but as an equal and an ally, and not a subject. Dorne would not bend the knee, which is something Aegon was not interested in. Another offer of alliance came from the boy king of the Vale, Ronald Arryn, or more realistically, the boy's mother, who was acting as his regent. She asked for all the lands east of the Green Fork of the Trident for the Vale's support against Black Harren. Again, Aegon never even contemplated these terms. Even the king in the north, Torrhen Stark of Winterfell, sat with his lords, bannermen and councillors late into the night at the Great Hall of Winterfell, discussing what was to be done about the new would-be conqueror. Aegon was an unknown quantity, and no one knew what to expect from him. The whole realm waited anxiously with bated breath to see where Aegon would move next. But, in the new words of House Targaryen, Aegon would only bring them fire and blood. The Westeros of Aegon's youth was divided into 7 quarrelsome kingdoms, and there was hardly a time when 2 or 3 of these kingdoms were not at war with one another. The Writings of Gildain, the World of Ice and Fire, Aegon's Conquest. Within only a handful of days of his first coronation at the Aegonfort, Aegon's armies were on the march yet again, this time with his sights set much further afield than the Crown Lands. The greater part of his host forded the fast-moving Blackwater Rush, once across the river, making south for Storm's End, through the ancient and thick Kingswood. This single army made up most of the Targaryen forces and was under the command of Orys Baratheon, Aegon's most trusted friend and advisor. Queen Rhaenys would follow Orys on the march from the sky, astride her dragon Meraxes, the golden-eyed dragon with gleaming silver scales. The Targaryen fleet, under the command of the now master of ships Daemon Balerion, left Blackwater Bay and turned north for Goldtown and the Vale. With them went Queen Visenya and her dragon, the mighty and fierce Vhagar. The king himself marched northwest with a small army towards the waters of the God's Eye and Harrenhal, the gargantuan fortress that was the pride and obsession of King Harren the Black. Of course, Aegon would be flying his own dragon, Balerion the Black Dread. So while he had a smaller army, the protection a dragon offered mitigated this fact. Harren had beggared the Riverlands and the Iron Islands alike to ornate his dream. The Thoughts of Catelyn Stark, A Clash of Kings Chapter 7, Catelyn 1. All 3 of the Targaryen armies faced rather fierce opposition, more so than history would imply. Lord Errol, Fell and Buckler, bannerman to King Argilac Durrandon of Storm's End, surprised the vanguard of Orys Baratheon's host as they were crossing the Wendwater River, cutting down more than 1,000 men before quickly fading back into the trees. It was one of the largest single losses of life for Aegon during the conquest, but sadly inevitable. Meanwhile, back in Blackwater Bay, House Arryn managed to hastily assemble a fleet, mostly augmented by a dozen Braavosi warships, which cost a small fortune to hire. They managed to defeat the Targaryen fleet in the waters off Goldtown before a single ship could land troops ashore. While less men died in the waters of Goldtown as in the Kingswood, House Targaryen still suffered some huge blows from this loss. Perhaps the biggest was the fact that among the dead was Aegon's admiral and master of ships, Daemon Balerion. It is speculated that Daemon did not foresee the hiring of the Braavosi ships, which added not just numbers to the Arryn fleet, but skilled sailors as well. Even Aegon himself was not immune to some of these troubles. As he marched for Harrenhal, he was attacked on the south shore of the God's Eye, not once, but twice, by a small force who disappeared as fast as they had appeared. While the Battle of the Reeds was a Targaryen victory, they still suffered heavy losses at the Wailing Willows, when two of King Harren's sons crossed the God's Eye in longboats with muffled oars and fell upon Aegon's rear in the dead of night, before once again disappearing into the darkness. Dragons are fire made flesh, and fire is power. Quaithe to Daenerys Targaryen, A Clash of Kings Chapter 27, Daenerys 2. While House Targaryen did suffer these losses that are overlooked in the legend that became the Conquest, in the end though, Aegon's enemies had no answer for his dragons. While the sailors of House Arryn and the Braavosi warships did indeed sink a third of the Targaryen fleet, and captured near as many in the waters of Goldtown, they in turn too paid a high price for this apparent victory, because in truth it was not a total victory for House Arryn, and they would learn the hard way the power a dragon has. In the midst of the battle, Queen Visenya descended upon them from the sky and burned just as many of the Arryn ships. Meanwhile, in the Kingswood, Lord Errol, Fell and Buckler hid in their familiar forests, using the treetops to hide their movements and disappear into nothing. That's until Queen Rhaenys unleashed Meraxes, and a wall of fire swept through the woods, turning the trees into torches, burning all in its path. And on the God's Eye, as the sons of Harren the Black fled back to their castle after the victory at the Wailing Willows, they were all too ill prepared for when Balerion the Blackdread fell upon them out of the morning sky. Their longboat burned in black and crimson flame. Every man, including Harren's sons, not a single man, including Harren's sons, escaped the dragonfire to tell Harren of their apparent victory. But even so, Harren most of all would not heed the warning of the power of dragons. But it was not just Aegon who saw opportunity in a conquest. Aegon's foes also found themselves plagued by other enemies, who used the distraction of Aegon's conquest to launch their own attacks. The Stepstones, an island chain at the bottom of the narrow sea between Dorne and Essos, has proven a lawless den for petty kings and pirates for centuries, with it only ever briefly being under the control of one free city or another. They would prove to be a thorn in the side of Argilac the Arrogant, the Storm King, as he gathered his men at Storm's End. Pirates descended on the shores of Cape Wrath to take advantage of the absence of the fighting men. There were, of course, token forces left behind to defend the Cape, but not near enough to prevent the bold pirate attacks. But Argilac didn't just have to deal with the attacks on Cape Wrath, because the Dornish were, well, being Dornish, as Princess Mira Martell sent raiding parties out of the Red Mountains to sweep across the Dornish marches, sacking many settlements and keeps, and carrying off gold and captives for ransom. In the Vale, the boy king Rhaenyra Arryn had to contend with a rebellion on the Three Sisters when the sistermen renounced all allegiances to the Eyrie and proclaimed Lady Marla Sunderland their queen. However, given the isolated location of the Three Sisters and their lack of manpower, while an annoyance for the boy king and his mother, Queen Regent Shara Arryn, they were not a real threat to the Vale itself. They very much believed the situation could be dealt with after this would-be High King of Westeros had been defeated. While near, all of the kings had their own issues, none more so than Harren the Black, whose vice-like grip on the Riverlands was now being tested. He was greatly resented by many of the lords of the Trident, and in Aegon Targaryen, they saw hope in a better future, one without the tyranny of Black Harren. What is outside my walls is of no concern to me. Those walls are strong and thick, but not so high as to keep out a dragon. Dragons fly. I built in stone. Stone does not burn. When the sun sets, your line shall end. Harrenhal and Aegon Targaryen, the world of ice and fire. The Conquest. While all of the kings of Westeros faced some kind of attack from rivals at the very start of Aegon's conquest, foes who saw opportunity in the instability the conquest had brought, King Harrenhal, Harren the Black, the king of the Isles and Rivers, by far faced the biggest challenge to his rule. While House Hoare had ruled over the Riverlands since the days of Harren's grandfather, the Lords of the Trident, in truth, despised their Ironborn king. Thousands of Riverlanders had died building his great castle on the shores of the God's Eye, Harrenhal, and the kingdom itself had been stripped of materials, with many lords and small folk beggared by his need for gold to fund his project. In Aegon Targaryen, the Lords of the Trident saw a solution to their woes, and the Rivermen rose up against Black Harren. The rebel Riverlords were led by Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun, with countless others flocking to his banner when he declared for House Targaryen and raised the three-headed dragon banner above his seat of Riverrun. He rode out to join with Aegon with all of his strength, which gave his peers heart. One by one, lords declared for Aegon over Harren. The Blackwoods, the Mallisters, the Vances, the Brackens, the Pipers, the Strongs, all summoned their levies and descended on Harrenhal. King Harren was always said to be an overconfident man, and when he found himself suddenly outnumbered, he took refuge in his new, supposedly impregnable stronghold. It would take even the largest army ever assembled months, maybe years, to take the castle. Harrenhal was by far the largest ever raised in Westeros, boasting 5 gargantuan towers and an infinite source of fresh water from the God's Eye itself. Huge subterranean vaults, well stocked with provisions that could in theory last years, and massive walls of black stone, higher than any ladder and too thick to be broken by any ram or shattered by a trebuchet. Harren barred his gates and bunkered down with his remaining sons and supporters to withstand a siege, for however long that may be. Harren had beggared the Riverlands and the Iron Islands alike to ornate his dream. The Thoughts of Catelyn Stark, A Clash of Kings, Chapter 7, Catelyn 1. Aegon Targaryen was of a different mind altogether, and had no plans of a long, drawn-out siege slowing down his conquest. Once he had joined his army with that of Edmund Tully and the other Riverlords to ring the castle, he sent a maester to the gate under a peace banner to parley. Harren emerged to meet him, an old man and grey, yet still with a youthful ferocity in his gleaming black armour. Each king had his banner-bearer and his maester to attend, so the words they exchanged are still remembered today. One of the very few instances where the very words of Aegon Targaryen himself can be quoted directly, giving us a better insight into the man himself. "Yield now," Aegon began, "and you may remain as Lord of the Iron Islands. Yield now, and your sons shall live to rule after you. I have 8,000 men outside your walls." "What is outside my walls is of no concern to me," said Harren. "Those walls are strong and thick, but not so high to keep out dragons." "Dragons fly," said Aegon. "I built in stone," replied Harren. "Stone does not burn." To which Aegon said, "When the sun sets, your line shall end." Even the smallest chance of a peaceful outcome had now been lost, and all that remained for Harren, in the words of House Targaryen, were fire and blood. What Aegon would do next truly gave meaning to those words that would echo for generations. It is said that Harren spat at that and returned to his monstrous castle. Once inside, he sent every man of his to the parapets, armed with spears and bows and crossbows, promising land and riches to whichever one of them could bring the dragon down. "Had I a daughter, the dragon slayer could claim her hand as well," Harren proclaimed. "Instead, I shall give him one of Tully's daughters, or all 3 if he likes. Or maybe he could pick one of Blackwood's whelps, or Strong's, or any girl born to these traitors of the Trident, these lords of yellow mud." Then Harren retired to his tower, surrounded by his household guard, to have supper with his remaining sons, not knowing that his fate had already been sealed. No amount of stone, no amount of soldiers, no amount of confidence would stop the coming Black Dread. So has an ill repute, and one that's well deserved. It's said that Harren and his sons still walk the halls by night, afire. Those who look upon them also burst into flames. I fear no shade, sir. It is written in the 7-pointed star that spirits, wights and revenants cannot harm a pious man so long as he is armoured in faith. Then arm yourself in faith by all means, but wear a suit of mail and plate as well. Every man who holds this castle seems to come to a bad end. The mountain, the goat, even my father, Jaime Lannister and Bonifer Hasty. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 27, Jaime 3. As the last light of the sun faded, Harren's men stared into the gathering darkness, clutching at their spears and crossbows. When no dragon initially appeared, some may have believed that Aegon's threats had been hollow. They had obviously not heard about his victories thus far, but Aegon Targaryen did indeed take his dragon, Balerion the Blackdread, up high, through the clouds, up until the dragon was no bigger than a small black dot upon the moon. Then he descended rapidly, well inside the castle walls. On wings as black as pitch, Balerion plunged through the night, and when the great towers of Harrenhal appeared beneath him, the dragon roared his fury and bathed them in black fire, shot through with swirls of red and scarlet. The flames of any dragon are unimaginably hot. The Blackdread's was something different altogether. The true fury of old Valyria, alive once again. Stone does not burn. Harren had so boldly boasted in his meeting with Aegon. But again, this showed Harren's hubris, as of course, a castle was not made entirely of stone alone. Wood and wool and hemp and straw, bread and salted beef and grain, it all took fire. Nor were Harren's iron men made of stone. Smoking, screaming, shrouded in flame, they ran across the yard and tumbled from the walkways, to die upon the ground below, a quicker death than that of dragonflame. And even stone will crack and melt if fire is hot enough. The accounts of the river lords and maesters set outside Harrenhal in Aegon's camp later stated that the towers of Harrenhal glowed red against the night, like 5 great candles, and like candles they began to twist and melt as runnels of molten stone ran down their sides. This great fortress, now a twisted shadow of what it had been moments before. Harren the Black, the king of the Isles and Rivers, whose tyranny had haunted the Riverlands, died, and his last sons died with him in the fires that engulfed his monstrous fortress that night, as they were supposedly sat around a high table feasting. With Harren, the legendary House Hoare died with him, which would leave a huge power vacuum in the Iron Islands. So too did the Iron Islanders' hold on the Riverlands evaporate overnight as well, with the Rivermen free of Ironborn rule for the first time in 3 generations. The next morning, as the sun rose outside the smoking and smouldering ruins of the castle, Aegon Targaryen accepted oaths of fealty from Edmund Tully, Lord of Riverrun, and named him his first Lord Paramount, the Lord Paramount of the Trident. While not as powerful as a king, these Lord Paramounts would hold authority over their respective kingdoms on behalf of the king himself. The other River Lords did homage as well, to Aegon as king, and to Tully as their liege lord. And for the first time in a very long time, the Riverlands was now once again a unified kingdom, rather than hundreds of small and petty kingdoms that had made up most of their history. When the ashes had cooled enough to allow men to enter the castle safely, the swords of the fallen, many broken or melted into twisted ribbons of steel by dragonfire, were gathered up and sent back to the Aegonfort in wagons, as Aegon the Conqueror had another statement to the lords of Westeros he wished to make to cement the place of House Targaryen. So Argilac the Arrogant rode forth from Storm's End one last time to meet his foes in the open field, the writings of Archmaester Gildane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. While Aegon was burning Harrenhal into the twisted ruins we see today, further south across the Blackwater Rush and out into the other side of the Kingswood, Orys Baratheon and Queen Rhaenys Targaryen, with the bulk of the Targaryen army, set out to face the Storm King, Argilac Durridon. The bannermen of the Storm King would prove to be much more loyal than Harren the Black's rivermen, who had turned on their king at the first opportunity. King Argilac the Arrogant rallied his bannermen around him at his ancient seat of the Storm Kings, Storm's End. While the castle was much smaller than the likes of Harrenhal, most men agreed it was all but impregnable, and had proven so for thousands of years. But when news of his old enemy Harren's demise in the blaze of the black dragon flame, it was clear even the ancient walls of Storm's End would not stop a dragon. And Argilac knew that this host on his borders had such a dragon of their own. Lords Fell, Buckler and Errol had been harassing the Targaryen army as they marched through the Kingswood, that is until Rhaenys and her dragon Meraxes burned half the wood and killed Lord Errol in the process. Buckler and Fell with their broken and burned army, managed to reach Storm's End to tell their king of the presence of the dragon Meraxes. With that, the old warrior king roared that he did not intend to die as Harren had, cooked inside his own castle like a suckling pig, with an apple in his mouth. No stranger to battle, having won countless heroic victories himself, he would decide his own fate with a sword in hand. So Argilac the Arrogant rode forth from Storm's End one last time to meet his foes in the open field. While Argilac is remembered as the Arrogant, we must grant him plaudits where it's due. He had the courage to face his foe, to face the dragon in the field, while the so-called mighty Harren the Black feasted in his hall and burned. Argilac had grown older, his famous mane of black hair had gone grey, and his prowess at arms had faded. The writings of Archmaester Galdane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. At this stage, the element of surprise had been lost by both sides of the looming battle. Both knew what to expect from the opposing side. The Storm King's approach was expected by Orys Baratheon and his men. However, some had indeed expected him to remain and defend Storm's End. Queen Rhaenys, flying Meraxes, had witnessed Argilac's departure from his castle and was able to give the Hand of the King a full accounting of his enemy's numbers and dispositions. While we cannot know the number of each side of the battle for certainty due to the known amount of losses House Targaryen took on the march, we know at least they were outnumbered by the Stormlanders at least 2-1. With that, Orys decided that his best option was to decide the battlefield himself and let Argilac come to him. They would take up a strong position on the hills south of Bronzegate and dug in there on the high ground to await the coming of the Stormlanders. As the two armies came together, the Stormlands proved true to their name. A steady rain began to fall, and by midday it turned into a howling gale the likes had not been seen for many years. Some more poetic scholars like to claim this was the Stormlands coming to the aid of its king. But it seems not even the power of nature itself could stop the roaring fires of House Targaryen. The storm became so severe, some of King Argilac's bannermen urged him to delay his attack until the following day, in hopes the rain would pass. But the Storm King, outnumbering the conquerors almost 2-1, had almost 4 times as many knights and heavy horses, which in itself in theory should be enough to end the battle rather quickly, dragon or not. But this was no normal battle, and in truth Argilac lived up to his moniker, the Arrogant. They say it was the sight of the 3-headed dragon banner of House Targaryen, flapping sodden above his own land, that enraged him. Battle-seasoned old warrior did not fail to note the rain was blowing from the south as well, directly into the faces of the Baratheon army on the hills. So Argilac the Arrogant gave the command to attack, and the battle known to history as the Last Storm began. The battle was long and bloody, and lasted well into the night, and was far less one-sided than Aegon's Conquest of Harrenhal. Some even like to argue that the Last Storm was the most difficult and costly battle across the whole of Wars of Conquest, the bitter old Storm King putting up a hell of a last stand. 3 times Argilac the Arrogant personally led his knights on a mad charge against the Baratheon position up top the hills, but the slopes were steep, and the rains had turned the ground into a soft and muddy mess, so the warhorses struggled and floundered, and the chargers lost a lot of their cohesion and movement, and with that, Argilac's biggest asset was drastically weakened. While in theory less effective than mounted knights, the Stormlanders fared better when they sent up their spearmen up the hills in foot. The progress was slow, but blinded by the rain and the wind, the conquerors did not see them climbing up the hill till it was too late. More so, the rain had dampened the bowstrings of the archers and made their bows all but useless at longer ranges, and taking out a lot of the power needed to bring down more armoured attackers. One hill fell, then another, and on the 4th and final charge, the Storm King and his knights broke through the Baratheon centre on the final hill. And for a brief moment, it seemed like the old Storm King had done the impossible and beaten the immense power of House Targaryen. In the clamour of battle, they had forgotten one key detail. They had indeed broken the Baratheon line, as Orys had always intended them to. As they did, they came face to face with Queen Rhaenys Targaryen and her mighty dragon Meraxes, and in a moment, all was lost. Even on the ground, a dragon proves to be a formidable beast. Dickon Morrigan and the Bastard of Blackhaven, commanding the vanguard, were engulfed in dragon flame instantly, along with the other knights of Argilac's personal guard. The warhorses panicked and fled in terror, crashing into riders behind them and turning the charge into chaos. Men were ablaze, screaming all around him as the Storm King himself was thrown from his saddle, but miraculously, he survived the encounter. Yet, still, Argilac, the old Storm King, continued to battle on. He still had one last fight in him, with the old warrior wanting the death of a warrior. On his feet, with a sword in his hand. When Orys Baratheon came down the muddy hill with his own men, he found the old king holding off half a dozen men on his own, with as many corpses at his feet. "Stand aside," Baratheon commanded. He dismounted, so to meet the king on equal footing, and offered the Storm King one last chance to yield. Argilac spat and cursed him instead, and so they fought, the old warrior king with his streaming white hair and Aegon's fierce black-bearded half-brother. Each man took a wound from the other, both said to be quite serious. But in the end, the last of the Durandons got his wish, and the old Storm King died with a sword in his hand and a curse for Orys upon his lips. Despite the varied opinions of Argilac, most agree he died with more honour than the other kings of Westeros during the Wars of Conquest, and thus he is remembered for that. As you would expect, the death of their king took all heart out of the Stormlanders, and as the word spread that Argilac had fallen, his lords and knights threw down their swords and fled, or bent the knee to Orys and Rhaenys, who looked down at the battlefield from atop her dragon. These terms Argilac the Arrogant rejected angrily. Orys Baratheon was a base-born half-brother to Lord Aegon, it was whispered, and the Storm King would not dishonour his daughter by giving her hand to a bastard. The writings of Archmaester Gildane, Fire and Blood, Aegon's Conquest. In the days after the last storm, the news of the Baratheon victory spread quickly, by the men fleeing the battlefield and running south. It was feared for a few days that the ancient castle of Storm's End might suffer the same fate as Harrenhal. While Argilac was dead and the line of Storm Kings ended, he did still have one child, his beloved daughter Argella, the very daughter he refused to allow Orys Baratheon to marry, destroying any hope of a peaceful coexistence of House Targaryen. Argella was very much her father's daughter, and barred her gates at the approach of Orys and the Targaryen host, and declared herself the first Storm Queen. For a while it seemed like the burning of Storm's End was all but inevitable, as Rhaenys and Orys had no taste for a lengthy siege. So rather than bend the knee, the defenders of Storm's End would die to the last man she promised. When Queen Rhaenys and Meraxes flew into the castle to parley. "You can take my castle, but you will win only bones and blood and ashes," she announced to Rhaenys. But it seems not all in Storm's End were willing to follow Argella, especially as the tales of Harrenhal were widely known by this point. The garrison proved less eager to die. That night they raised a peace banner, threw open the castle gates, and delivered Argella Durrandon, gagged, chained and naked, to the camp of Orys Baratheon. It is said that Orys unchained her with his own hands, wrapped his cloak around her, poured her wine and spoke gently, telling her of her father's courage and the manner of his death, and afterwards, to honour the fallen king, Orys took the arms and words of House Durrandon for his own. The crowned stag became his sigil, Storm's End became his seat, and Lady Argella his wife, and thus began House Baratheon of Storm's End, while new, through Argella Durrandon, the legacy of the Storm Kings would still endure. It was the only time that Vhagar, Meraxes and Balerion were all unleashed at once. The singers called it the Field of Fire, the thoughts of Tyrion Lannister, A Game of Thrones Chapter 13, Tyrion 2. In a matter of months since his landing, Aegon the Conqueror had control of a significant part of Westeros, in the form of the Riverlands and Stormlands, and the newly formed Crownlands. Both the fallen kings, Harren the Black and Argilac Durrandon, had put up very different forms of resistance, but the power of the Targaryen dragons made their fates all but inevitable. Many do believe to this day, however, that while Harren died a coward's death hiding behind the thick walls of Harrenhal, the old Storm King, Argilac Durrandon, had died with a semblance of honour, with a sword in his hand and a curse upon his lips. With the two most immediate threats to the conquest now dealt with, it was time for the Targaryen conquerors to turn their attention to the remaining kingdoms of Westeros. But with the deaths of Harren and Argilac now widely known, the remaining kings of Westeros saw plainly that their own turns were coming. At Winterfell, King Torrhen Stark called his banners, but given the vast distances in the north, Torrhen knew that assembling an army would take time, and it would be weeks before they were ready to march. Queen Regent Shara Arryn of the Vale, regent for her young son King Ronald, took refuge in the Eyrie and looked to her defences, sending an army to the Bloody Gate, the gateway to the Vale of Arryn. Much like Storm's End, the Eyrie was said to be near impossible to capture. Built up atop the Giant's Lance, the only way up a tiny mountain path with a small lift system. Even to get to that point, you would have to overcome the Bloody Gate and the other way gates up the mountain, being funneled into small channels, meaning even a small number of Arryn men could hold the gate for an extended period of time. If the gate was overcome, the now tired and bloodied attackers would still have to deal with the other way gates and their near impossible task of assaulting the Eyrie itself. How a dragon could factor into this was not yet known. In her youth, Queen Shara had been lauded as the flower of the mountain, the fairest maid in all of the Seven Kingdoms. Perhaps hoping to sway Aegon with her beauty, she sent him a portrait and offered herself to him in marriage, provided he name her son Ronald as his heir. Though the portrait did finally reach Aegon, it's not known whether Aegon Targaryen even replied to her proposal. He had 2 queens already, and Shara Arryn was then a faded flower, at least 10 years older than Aegon. In real terms, the Vale and the North posed little threat to Aegon's growing kingdom at this stage. However, the same could not be said of the Reach or the Westerlands. These 2 great kings had made common cause and assembled their own armies, while Aegon dealt with Harren and Argilac, intent on putting an end to Aegon for good and all, and filling the void of power felt in the other kingdoms themselves. From Highgarden marched King Mern the Ninth Gardener, king of the Reach, with a mighty host. Beneath the walls of Golden Grove, the seat of House Rowan, he met with King Loren the First Lannister, king of the Rock, leading his own sizable host down from the Westlands. These 2 kingdoms had been warring on and off for centuries, with Mern and Loren bitter rivals. Thus was the threat Aegon posed to them. They joined their forces. Together, the 2 kings commanded the mightiest host Westeros had seen in countless generations, an army 55,000 strong, including at least 600 lords, great and small, and more than 5,000 mounted knights. Ours, our iron fist, boasted King Mern. His 4 sons rode beside him, and both of his young grandsons attended him personally as squires. The whole of House Gardner would play a role in what would surely be a legendary victory for the ages. Mern and Loren did not linger at Golden Grove, as a host this large moves slowly and drains resources from wherever they march. The new allies set out at once, marching north by northeast through the tall grasses and golden fields of wheat. It is believed that Aegon's advanced scouts brought him word of their march while he was still camped beside the God's Eye and the smouldering remains of Harrenhal. Aegon gathered his own strength and advanced to meet these new foes head-on. He commanded only 1/5 as many men as the 2 kings, and much of his strength was made up of men sworn to the Riverlords, whose loyalty to House Targaryen was very recent and untested so far, but they did seem loyal to Edmund Tully. And Tully had taken a huge risk in backing Aegon over Harren the Black, which earned him Aegon's trust. But with a smaller host, however, Aegon was able to move much more quickly than his foes. At the town of Stony Sept, both his queens joined him with their dragons, Rhaenys from Storm's End, and Visenya from Crackclaw Point, where she had accepted fervent pledges of fealty from local lords. Together, the 3 Targaryens watched from across the sky as Aegon's army crossed the headwaters of the Blackwater Rush and raced to meet their coming foes. The 2 armies came together amongst the wide, open plains south of the Blackwater, near to where the Gold Road would one day run. The 2 kings were more than pleased when their scouts returned to them, reporting the Targaryen numbers. They had 5 men for every one of Aegon's, it seemed, and that disparity in lords and knights was even greater, and the land was wide and open, all grass and wheat as far as the eye could see, ideal for heavy horses. Aegon Targaryen would not command the high ground, as Orys Baratheon had done at the last storm. The ground was firm, and not muddy, nor would they be troubled by any rain. The day was cloudless, though windy, something that would later prove to be a defining factor of the battle. In fact, there had been no rain for more than 2 weeks. All this shows the sheer arrogance of the kings. The burning of Harrenhal, the last storm, both should have been warnings to King Mern and King Loren, but if it was, they surely underestimated it. King Mern had brought double the men to the battle as King Loren, not surprising given the larger population of his kingdom, and so demanded the honour of commanding the centre. His son and heir Edmund was given the vanguard. King Loren and his knights would form the right, with Lord Oakhart the left. With no natural barriers to anchor the Targaryen line, the two kings meant to sweep around Aegon on both flanks, then take him from the back, whilst the Iron Fist and the great wedge of armoured knights and high lords smashed through Aegon's centre. As battles go, both kings and their lords expected it to be straightforward, easy, and with minimal losses to their numbers. The idea of defeat was not even a notion that crossed anyone's mind. Aegon Targaryen conquered Westeros with dragons. Asher Greyjoy to Euron Greyjoy. A Feast for Crows, Chapter 19, The Drowned Man. In turn, Aegon Targaryen lined up his own men in a rough crescent shape, bristling with spears and pikes, perfect for slowing the charge of mounted knights, with archers and crossbowmen just behind, and light cavalry on either of his flanks. Some expected he would have given the command of the ground forces to his hand of the king, Orys Baratheon, but we're not even sure Orys was able to attend the battle, given Rhaenys had come from Storm's End on Dragonback. So instead he gave command of his host to Jon Mooten, Lord of Maidenpool, one of the first foes to come over to his cause. This was no slight against Orys, who had won the Battle of the Last Storm. Rather, Aegon wanted to show trust to his other lords as well. The king himself intended to do his fighting from the sky, beside his queens. Aegon had noted the absence of rain as well. The grass and wheat that surrounded the armies was tall and ripe for harvest, and very dry. At the sound of their trumpets, the large host of King Mern and King Loren started forth beneath a sea of green banners, sparkling with Lannister red. King Mern himself led the charge against the centre with his golden stallion, his son Gwaine beside him with his banner, with a great green hand upon a field of white. Roaring and screaming, urged on by horns and drums, the Gardeners and Lannisters charged through a storm of arrows and crossbow bolts onto their foe, sweeping aside the Targaryen spearmen, shattering their ranks. But by then, Aegon and his sisters were already in the air, and the reality was, Aegon had already won this battle before it had even begun. Aegon and his sisters flew above the ranks of his foes upon their dragons, through a storm of spears and stones and arrows, swooping down repeatedly to bathe their foes in flame. Rhaenys and Visenya set fires upwind of the enemy and behind them. The dry grasses and stands of wheat went up at once, and the wind fanned the flames and blew the smoke into the faces of their advancing ranks of the two kings. The scent of the fire sent their mounts into a panic, and as the smoke thickened, horses and riders alike were blinded. Their ranks began to break as walls of fire rose on every side of them. Lord Mooten's men, safely upwind of the flames, waited with their bows and spears, and made short work of the burned and burning men who came staggering from the inferno. The Field of Fire. The battle was named afterwards. More than 4,000 men died in the flames. Another 1,000 perished by sword and spear and arrow. Tens of thousands suffered burns, some so bad they would remain scarred for life. King Mern IX was dead, together with his sons and grandsons, brothers, cousins, and all other kin. One nephew did survive for 3 days, but when he died of his burns, House Gardner died with him. King Loren Lannister of the Rock lived, riding through a wall of flame and smoke to safety when he saw the battle was lost. The Targaryens lost fewer than 100 men, with Queen Visenya taking an arrow to one shoulder, but soon recovered. As the dragons gorged themselves on the dead, Aegon commanded that the swords of the slain be gathered up and sent down the river to the Aegonfort. If truth be told, even our claim to Highgarden is a bit dodgy, just as those dreadful Florents are always whining. Olenna Tyrell to Sansa Stark. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 6, Sansa 1. Loren Lannister was captured the next day. The King of the Rock laid his sword and crown at Aegon's feet, bent the knee, and did him homage. And Aegon, true to his promise, lifted his beaten foe back to his feet, and confirmed him in his lands and his lordship, naming him Lord of Casterly Rock and his Warden of the West. Loren's bannermen followed his example, and so too did many Lords of the Reach who had survived the dragonfire. Yet the conquest of the West remained incomplete. So King Aegon parted from his sisters and marched at once to Highgarden, the seat of House Gardener, hoping to secure its surrender before some other claimant could seize it for his own. He found the castle in the hands of its stewards, Harlan Tyrell, whose forebears had served the Gardeners for centuries. Tyrell yielded up the keys to the castle without a fight, and pledged his support to the conquering king. In reward, Aegon granted him Highgarden and all its domains, naming him Warden of the South and Lord Paramount of the Mander, and giving him dominion over all of House Gardener's former vassals. Is this some special place? This is the Inn of the Kneeling Man, m'lady. It stands upon the very spot where the last king in the north knelt before Aegon the Conqueror to offer his submission. That's him on the sign, I suppose. Torrhen had brought his power south after the fall of the two kings on the Field of Fire, but when he saw Aegon's dragons and the size of his host, he chose the path of wisdom and bent his frozen knees. Brienne of Tarth, Cleos Frey, and Jaime Lannister. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 11. Jaime 2. After defeating the ancient kings of House Gardener and Lannister at the Field of Fire, and raising House Tyrell as Lords of Highgarden and Lords Paramount of the Reach, the Westerlands and most of the Reach were under the control of Aegon the Conqueror and House Targaryen. Aegon's intent at this time was to continue his march south and enforce the submission of Old Town, the Arbor, and then his biggest test in Dorne. But while still at Highgarden, word of a new challenge came to his ears, which diverted his attention. House Hightower and Old Town could wait, as King Torrhen Stark, king in the north, after many weeks of preparation and gathering of his men, had crossed the neck and entered the Riverlands, leading an army of savage Northmen, 30,000 strong. Aegon started northward at once atop his dragon, Balerion, flying ahead of the army, sending word to his queens Visenya and Rhaenys as well to follow after him. He rallied his ever-growing army of men who had bent the knee at his landing after the Burning of Harrenhal, the Last Storm, and the Field of Fire. It seemed even without dragons, the Targaryens would be more than a match for the Northmen. One thing for sure at this stage, if battle was fought, then regardless of dragons or numbers of men, it was all but certain to be just as bloody, if not more so, than those that had defined the conquest thus far. Even after crossing the neck, the march for the Northmen to meet their foes was still going to be long, despite them marching at their fullest speed, and they did indeed march with haste, hardly stopping to rest and camp each night. King Torrhen, if he could, would have liked to have marched without stopping for long rests to catch the Targaryen host off guard, but he was also well aware the pace of their movements would inevitably tire and drain the energy of his men, which could in itself be a deciding factor when battle was joined. When Torrhen Stark eventually reached the banks of the Trident, the size of Aegon's army was significantly bigger than he had been informed when he left Winterfell. He found a host, again half the size of his own, around 60,000 men strong, many of them fresh, at the very least well rested, likely having been camped for a long while. Riverlords, Westermen, Stormlanders, men of the Reach, they all had come. But it was not the size of the army on the other side of the river that gave King Torrhen pause. Above their camps, Balerion, Meraxes and Vhagar, the fire and sheer power behind Aegon and his conquest, prowled the skies in ever-widening circles. It does seem that King Torrhen was at least somewhat more informed than his peers when it came to the power of a dragon, let alone 3. Torrhen had sent scouts ahead of his main force. These men had seen the smouldering ruins of Harrenhal, where slow red fire still burnt below the rubble, many weeks after the fact. He'd also heard how a single dragon turned the tide during the last storm that saw the downfall of the Storm Kings, but more importantly, he had been given several different accounts of the events at the Field of Fire, how Aegon, despite being hugely outnumbered, burned the army of House Gardener and Lannister to cinders, with thousands dying in the process. King Torrhen Stark was not like the other kings of Westeros, and rather than ignore what he saw in front of him, he very well knew the fate of not just himself, but his 30,000 Northmen who had followed him would be bloody should he try and force a crossing of the river. Some of his lord's bannermen, however, still urged him to press the attack all the same. insisting that northern valour would carry the day. While the northern courage was admirable, it was not enough to sway King Torrhen. Others urged him instead to fall back to Moat Cailin and make their stand there on northern soil, with Moat Cailin pushing back invaders into the north for thousands of years. But dragonfire would burn it all the same. Then, the king's bastard brother, a man by the name of Brandon Snow, offered another solution. Some say bold and brave, others foolish and a folly. He put himself forward to cross the Trident alone under the cover of darkness that very night, to slay the dragons while they slept, a plan that was almost certain to fail. King Torrhen Stark, however, in the end did send Brandon Snow across the Trident, but not in the manner Brandon would have hoped for. He crossed the river with 3 maesters by his side, not to kill dragons or assassinate a king, but to treat and try and find a way forward that was palatable for both sides. It was not going to be an easy task when it was very clear that Aegon wanted Torrhen's kingdom. All through the night, messages went back and forth between the camps. The exact contents of these letters is something that has been lost to history and will forever remain between Aegon and Torrhen. But what we can say for sure is the next morning, King Torrhen Stark found himself across the Trident with a small retinue. There upon the south bank, he knelt, laid his ancient crown of Kings of Winter at Aegon's feet, and swore to be his man. He rose as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, king no more. From that day to this, Torrhen Stark is remembered as the King Who Knelt. But no Northman left his burned bones beside the Trident, and the swords Aegon collected from Lord Stark and his vassals were not twisted or bent or melted as part of his Iron Throne. After Torrhen Stark bent the knee on the banks of the Trident, securing the north for Aegon, it was time once again for Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys, his queens, to part company once more, each with their own mission. Aegon himself turned south once again, marching slowly towards Oldtown in the Reach, the seat of House Hightower, arguably currently the most powerful house in the Reach. Whilst his 2 sisters mounted their own dragons, Visenya for the Vale of Arryn, and Rhaenys for Sunspear and the harsh deserts of Dorne. In theory, should their missions be successful, Aegon's conquest would be completed, with the whole of Westeros secure under the might of House Targaryen. The Eyrie is impregnable. You saw it yourself. No enemy could reach us up here. Lysa Arryn to Catelyn Stark. A Game of Thrones Chapter 34. Catelyn 6. The capture of the Vale was always going to be a tricky affair. The location of the Eyrie made it near impossible to attack and capture by any conventional means, at least without shedding an unimaginable amount of blood trying to get past the Gate of the Moon and up the Giant's Lance to the Eyrie itself. Thus, Visenya Targaryen would attempt a different approach. When she left her siblings, she took only her dragon, Vhagar, leaving the now large Targaryen army behind. The Regent Queen of the Vale, Shara Arryn, had strengthened the defences of Goldtown and moved a strong host to the Bloody Gate and tripled the size of the garrison in the stone, snow and sky way castles that guarded the approach to the Eyrie itself. But as Visenya had foreseen, all of these defenders proved useless against Vhagar, who flew above them all and landed in the Eyrie's inner courtyard. Shara rushed out to confront Visenya, with a dozen guards at her back, but much to her horror, the Dragon Queen was with Rhaenyra Arryn, the boy king, seated on her knee, staring at Vhagar, wonderstruck. Visenya, a grim and confident smile across her face. While the exact words of what happened next are lost to us, we do know that Rhaenyra looked to his mother and begged her to let him go flying with the Dragon Lady. There were no threats spoken, no rage-filled words exchanged, only Visenya's knowing smile. Shara, well aware of the position she now found herself in, simply smiled back as she exchanged courtesies with Visenya, all the while Rhaenyra was transfixed with the mighty dragon. Then, the now Lady Shara sent for the 3 crowns, her own regent's coronet, her son's small crown, and the falcon crown of the mountain in the Vale that the Arryn kings had worn for thousands of years, surrendering them to Queen Visenya and House Targaryen, along with the swords of her garrison. It was said that afterwards, Little King flew 3 times around the summit of the Giant's Lance and landed to find himself a little lord. Thus did Visenya Targaryen bring the Vale of Arryn into her brother's realm, without shedding a single drop of blood, a feat that is often overlooked when talking about the valour of Aegon's conquest. He did not conquer here. Elsewhere he burnt his foes, him and his sisters, but here we melted away before them, leaving only stone and sand for them to burn, and round the dragons went, snapping at their tails for the want of any other food, till they were tied in knots. Vale and Dorne, to Daemon Sand, the Windsor Winter Sample Chapters, Arianne 1. Rhaenys Targaryen had no such easy conquest that her sister had faced, as she was sent to deal with Dorne, a kingdom that would remain a thorn in the side of House Targaryen for the better part of the next 200 years. A small host of Dornish spearmen guarded the prince's pass, the gateway through the Red Mountains into the endless sands of Dorne. Sensibly, Rhaenys did not engage them. Rather, she flew above the pass, above the red sands, above the white, and descended upon the castle of Vaith to demand its submission like she had done so many times before in the Crownlands. This time, much to her surprise, she only found the castle empty and abandoned. It seemingly had been like this for a long while. In a small, dusty town beneath its walls, only women and children and older men remained, not the people Rhaenys had come to force into submission. When she asked where the lords had gone, they would only say, away, and could not elaborate any further. It is debated to this day if the small folk were simply feigning ignorance, or genuinely did not know the location of their fighting men. Rhaenys followed the river downstream to God's Grace, but it was too deserted. On she flew until the Greenblood met with the Summer Sea, where Rhaenys came upon the Planky Town, where hundreds of pole boats, fishing skiffs and barges, houseboats and hulks sat baking in the sun, joined together with ropes and chains and planks to make a floating city. Yet only a few old women and children appeared to peer up at her as Meraxes circled overhead. It very much seemed like every fighting man of Dorne had vanished into the sands. Unable to find a foe, eventually Rhaenys flew to Sunspear, the ancient seat of House Martell, where she found the Princess of Dorne waiting in her abandoned castle. Mira Martell was 80 years of age and had ruled Dorne for 60 of those years. She was very fat, essentially blind, and almost bald, her skin sallow and sagging. Argilac the Arrogant, the old Storm King who had warred with Mira countless times, named her the Yellow Toad of Dorne, but neither age nor blindness had dulled her wit. I will not fight you, Princess Mira told Rhaenys, nor will I need you. Dorne has no king. Tell your brother that. I shall, Rhaenys replied. But we will come again, Princess, and next time we shall come with fire and blood. Your words, said Princess Mira. Ours are, unbowed, unbent, unbroken. You may burn us, my lady, but you will not bend us, break us, or make us bow. This is Dorne. You are not wanted here. Return at your peril. Thus, Queen and Princess parted, and Dorne remained unconquered, for how can you conquer a place when its very people dissolve into the shadows waiting to rebel against you the moment you turn your gaze the other way? As history shows us, both the words of House Martell and Targaryen would come true. Rhaenys would indeed bring fire and blood to Dorne, but Dorne would remain, unbowed, unbent, and unbroken. Oldtown was a venerable labyrinth of a city, all wines and crisscrossing alleys and narrow crook-back streets. The thoughts of Pate, A Feast for Crows, Prologue. As we well know, despite the way history makes it seem, Aegon's conquest officially started in 2 BC and ended with his second coronation in Oldtown 2 years later. That means Aegon was fighting the Wars of Conquest for the better part of 2 years. When you were told of the conquest, it very much comes across as happening much quicker, a few weeks to months maybe. But when you factor in the sheer size of the task Aegon faced and the size of the kingdom he was forging, it's not surprising it took 2 years when you factor in simple things like the time marching between battles, consolidating his rule, and rallying his ever-growing army and fostering stability. Still, for the size of the task Aegon and his sisters accomplished, 2 years is a historical heartbeat. But first, before he could be crowned for the second time, Aegon had one last task to complete: the capture of Oldtown. then the largest and most important city in Westeros, home to the ancient House Hightower, one of the oldest and richest families in Westeros. Oldtown was ringed with massive walls, and was not just home to the Hightower, but was also the centre of the faith in Westeros, the home of the High Septon himself, the father of the faithful, the voice of the gods on earth, who commanded the obedience of millions of devout throughout the realms, save the north, where the old gods still held sway over the people. The city was also home to the Blades of the Faith militant, the fighting order of the small folk, called the Stars and Swords. And finally, it was also the home of the Maesters and the ancient Sanctuary of Knowledge, known as the Citadel. Oldtown, in many ways, was the centre of culture in Westeros. The Hightowers are an ancient family, very rich and very proud. Jorah Mormont to Daenerys Targaryen. A Clash of Kings, Chapter 12, Daenerys 1. Between the might of House Hightower, the sheer devotion of the faith militant, and the brilliant minds of the Maesters, if there were to be a siege, a battle for Oldtown, it would surely take a long time and would be bloody, dragons or not. Yet to his surprise, when Aegon Targaryen and his host approached Oldtown, they found the city gates open and Lord Manfred Hightower waiting to make his submission willingly. As it happened, when word of Aegon's landing on the waters of the Blackwater Rush first reached Oldtown, the High Septon had locked himself within the starry sept for 7 days and 7 nights, seeking the guidance of the gods. He took no nourishment but bread and water, and spent all his waking hours in prayer, moving from one altar to the next, seeking help and answers. On the 7th day, the crone had lifted up her golden lamp to show him the path ahead. If Oldtown took up arms against Aegon and the dragons, the High Septon saw the city would surely be burned, and the Hightower and the Citadel and the very starry sept would be cast down and destroyed. Or, at the very least, this is what the stories claim. Could something like this have happened? Yes. Can we say for any certainty that it did? Unfortunately not. But the High Septon still did not have the power to force Lord Manfred Hightower to open his gates and submit to the Dragon Lord. Luckily for the faith, Lord Manfred was a cautious lord, very godly, and a God-fearing man. One of his younger sons served within the Warrior's Sons, and another had only recently taken his vows as a Septon. When the High Septon told him of his vision, Lord Hightower was determined he would not oppose the Conqueror by force of arms. This goes a long way into explaining why no men of Oldtown burned on the field of fire, though the Hightowers were bannermen to the gardeners of Highgarden for thousands of years. And thus it was Lord Manfred who rode up to greet Aegon as he approached, and offer up his sword, his city, his oath. Some say Lord Hightower also offered the hand of his youngest daughter, which Aegon politely declined. From where it stood atop the bluffs of Battle Isle, its shadow cut the city like a sword. The thoughts of Pate, on the Hightower, a feast of crows, prologue. While staying in Oldtown, it's believed that Aegon stayed within the ancient Hightower itself, in Lord Manfred's own apartments at the top of the tower. After 3 days in Oldtown in the majestic starry sept, His High Holiness the High Septon himself anointed Aegon with 7 oils, placed a new crown upon his head, and proclaimed him Aegon of House Targaryen, the first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the 7 Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. While the 7 Kingdoms was used as a style, Dorne had not yet submitted, nor would it for more than a century to come. Only a handful of lords had been present for Aegon's first coronation at the mouth of the Blackwater in the Aegonfort almost 2 years prior. But now, hundreds from across the 7 Kingdoms were on hand to witness his second, and tens of thousands cheered him afterwards in the streets of Oldtown as he rode through the city on Balerion the Blackdread's back. Amongst those at Aegon's second coronation were the Maesters and Archmaesters of the Citadel. It is speculated it may be for this reason alone it was this coronation, rather than the Aegonfort crowning on the day of his landing, that became fixed as the start of Aegon's reign. We have no word as to if Aegon's sisters, Queen Visenya and Rhaenys, were present at the second coronation, but many do assume that at the very least Rhaenys was, Given Dorne's proximity to Old Town, with it not being impossible for Visenya to also make the trip on Dragonback from the Vale, depending on how events sit in the very vague timeline. Thus, the 7 kingdoms of Westeros were hammered into one great unified realm by the will of Aegon the Conqueror and his sisters. Many thought that King Aegon would make Old Town his royal seat after the war was done, while others thought he would rule from the ancestral Targaryen seat of Dragonstone. The king surprised them all by proclaiming his intent to make his court in the new town already rising upon the 3 hills at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where he and his sisters had first stepped foot on the soils of Westeros, as legends like to claim. King's Landing, the new town would be called. From then on, Aegon Targaryen would rule his realm, holding his court from a great metal seat made from the melted, twisted, beaten and broken blades of all of his foes, a perilous seat that would soon be known throughout the world as the Iron Throne of Westeros.